Good evening, everyone. My name is Jen McHugh, and I'm the manager of adult learning at the Michener Art Museum. Thank you for joining us tonight for our virtual program, Nameless No More, Meet the Real-Life Women Who Modeled for American Sculpture. This program was designed to help our guests see beyond the exhibition Monuments and Myths, and for the viewer to get to know Audrey Munson and Hettie Anderson, two of Augustus Saint-Gaudens and Daniel Chester French's favorite models. These women carved a living for themselves out of an emerging and competitive field at a time when women were only just beginning to find work outside the home. Although the final sculptures largely depict allegorical figures and goddesses, it's these all too real women whose faces decorate American civic spaces. Tonight, our presentation will be given by someone that usually does most of her work behind the scenes, the Michener Registrar, Rebecca McCarron. Rebecca has a master's in museum leadership from Drexel University and a master's in history from Oxford. While there, she researched the history of girlhood iconography and its role in the visual politics of the women's suffrage movement. She had a publication on that subject appear in the Women's History Review. So I will pass it over to Rebecca. Upon the conclusion of her presentation, we'll have time for Q&A. And so write your questions in the Q&A or the chat. Okay?
That introduction,
Jen. Rebecca.
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen so we can see the presentation and get started. Let's see. Hopefully, get that going. Hopefully everyone can see that. I wanted to start tonight by explaining kind of why I chose to step out from behind the scenes. And it has a lot to do with this lead image. It's included in a lot of our exhibition materials, and the title I think is very striking. It's possibly Hettie Anderson. And I found that really interesting as someone who spends a lot of time with the credit lines, that this woman who's so well known as an artist model, we can't identify her face for certain from a photograph, even though her face graces many of the sculptures in the exhibition. And that kind of prompted me to do some more research and kind of led to this presentation. And I ended up finding a lot of connections with some of my previous work about girlhood iconography at the turn of the last century and women in pop culture at that time. And by happy accident, connected it to the stories of Hettie Anderson and Audrey Munson. We're going to talk about Augustus Saint-Gaudens and Daniel Chester French, but mainly in connection with these women. And so they won't be the stars of the show tonight. They'll have to, we love them, but not tonight. And I think also something I wanted to clarify is why I chose to focus on just two. There are obviously other models that sculptors used at the time, but these two were featured heavily in the works in the exhibition and also didn't have a close personal relationship to the artist. So they're not wives, daughters, girlfriends. And I think that that allows for a conversation about these women as wage earners and as occupying space in a way that is different from what we've seen prior. I wanted to point out that while doing research for this, I found an article that kind of breaks down what women were paid for this type of work. It's about 50 cents an hour, according to an article published in 1899. To give that context, Augustus Saint-Gaudens was paid about $22,000 for the Shaw Memorial that same year. So there's definitely a pay discrepancy, but the work is crucial to the end result. And so tonight, we're going to unpack not just the lives of Hettie and Audrey, but the work that they did and the context in which they did it. I included these images to give us all a sense of scale and the prevalence of these images to this day. I didn't know as much about Hettie and Audrey specifically, but I recognized a lot of these images, particularly the Liberty coin, which I think is famous and really well known. I mean, well, anyone who's seen the exhibit, and I'm not sure if you have, but victory is prominently featured as well. They have the spirit of life. This is Civic Fame, top the municipal building in New York. So again, the depth and breadth of the work and the way that these women's faces are kind of plastered all over our cities to this day. Um, I want to talk about too how models and sculpture are created from the models and the sculptures that were made from their forms exist in a really specific context in the United States in terms of building a national identity and portraying certain ideals. So these women who were chosen as models had those physical attributes. They were young and had kind of classical Greco-Roman forms to their face and figures, which were prevalent in American art at the time, and were also used to convey a specific national identity to really diverse audiences. People who maybe didn't speak a language. It's the beauty of images and visuals is that you don't have to know the language of the place that you are to be impacted by the visual images. I think I would be remiss to talk about beauty standards at this time without mentioning racial identity and whiteness as part of that beauty standard. I bring it up also in part because the real life women who were models didn't fit that standard. Audrey is the daughter of an Irish immigrant, or her mother and grandmother's side are from Ireland at a time when Irish immigrants are not a welcome group in the United States. Hettie is a Black woman from South Carolina. So the real lives and identities of these women are so much more complicated and nuanced than some of the ideals that they were portraying in men's sculpture. Here I've included some great images. The one here, I don't know if you can see this, is called Star Maiden, and it was featured heavily in the Panama Pacific exhibition in 1915, which is a really major World's Fair. If anyone's heard of the 1893 exhibition in Chicago, it's kind of comparable in scale to that. So I found that these, again, give us a sense of the prevalency of the sculpture. And these were published in newspapers. Americans would have had access to these images. A lot would have been widespread and well known. I included this final image here with the crane because that's Brooklyn being moved to her new home in front of the Brooklyn Museum in the mid 20th century. So these sculptures haven't disappeared. They haven't gone away. They're still here and taking up space in our cities. And the women behind them are not as well known as the sculptures we may be familiar with. I think before we can dive into Hetty and Audrey as people, though, we need to explore the context in which they lived and worked. I included this mural by Tristan Eaton, who's a famous street artist. And this image is on the corner, I think, of 236 Fifth Avenue and 27th Street in New York. And it's called The Gilded Lady. It is a composite of different pop culture images. The building is built in 1906, 1907. So he went to New York Historical Society and pulled images that he felt represented the pop culture of that time period. And lucky for me, it does a really nice job of summarizing a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight. The overall image is meant to be a Gibson girl, which we'll break down and talk about for those of us that don't know what that is. You'll see Diana at the top of the hat. And then in the bottom corner, you'll see Miss Brooklyn. And the overall face is Evelyn Nesbit Thaw, who's another famous artist model. We won't talk about her too much, but we'll mention her because she did similar work to Audrey and Hetty and is kind of a pop culture icon of this time and helps us unpack a lot of what's going on. I also want to point out the location is a place that's famous for its shopping, which is a really important development happening in the early 20th century. Department stores are booming, and they are a place and a space where women are welcome, and they're both working behind the counters as shop girls, but also as consumers and unchaperoned, allowed to go to these. It's one of the first places women are allowed to go unchaperoned while maintaining their reputations. So we'll get into that too. But before we do any of that, we're going to talk about the monuments and why there was a call for sculpture like the sculpture in our exhibit. At this time, it's this period in American architecture is called the American Renaissance. Um, Roughly the dates are 1876 to 1917. But basically what's happening is the United States sees itself as kind of an heir to Greek democracy and Roman law and this Renaissance humanism. And it's coming through in our architecture. So Beaux Arts architecture is booming. You have McKim, Mead, and White as kind of the most prominent architectural firm at this time. Geez. We go. Um, I included that image here because you can see Diana on top of Madison Square Garden, which I thought was good fun. But yes, so a lot of our national monuments are built during this time. The National Mall in DC is kind of part of this movement. And a lot of the work that's being built, there's a call for sculpture and figures. And a lot of the depictions of women in on these buildings, it's allegorical. So you have, women as justice, women as liberty, and it's a way to communicate these core concepts that form the national identity these men envisioned for us, in a way that diverse groups can digest and understand. You have New York is a city of immigrants at this point, so not everyone is speaking English, but again, that language of images is really important. I did also want to talk about Stanford White specifically because he is so connected to Saint-Gaudens and artist models as an occupation. His daybook is one of the earliest mentions we have of Hettie Anderson in the historic record. And he has his own kind of scandalous connection to artist models. I don't want to go down this rabbit hole. It's fun, but I don't think we have the time. In 1906, Stanford White is murdered by a very wealthy heir named Thaw, and he was married to this artist model, Evelyn Nesbit. During the course of it's called the trial of the century. It gets widely publicized in yellow journalism. It's tabloid fodder. Thaw shoots Stanford White in a public space in a theater, point blank. So it's a very well publicized trial, but it's shrouded in scandal because over the course of the trial, it comes out that Evelyn Nesbit was under the care of Stanford White as a very young girl when she first moved to New York. He was kind of a patron of hers and promoted her. And over the course of the trial, it becomes clear that he is alleged to have raped her at the age of 14. And he would have been 48 at the time. This scandal has a big impact on how people see artist models and their kind of reputations as being unsupervised in the art studio with older men. And a year after this murder happens, Augustus Saint-Gaudens dies in 1907, and his family is hyper aware of the bad publicity associated with Stanford White, with his relationship with an artist model, and they're eager to protect Saint-Gaudens' legacy and avoid association with that scandal and with Stanford White. So I think part of the reason that artist models get pushed aside and depersonalized is because of this murder trial. So I wanted to point it out for that reason. I won't go into too much detail, but I could honestly probably do a whole separate presentation just on that. Moving back into that talk of department stores and the kind of changing sphere that's happening in the United States at this time, I included some images here just of women shopping. I know that seems silly, but I feel like we think of that as not a big deal. And at this time, it is a day out. It is such a big deal to go to a department store, to have a place in a space where you have buying power. It's a novelty and it's really exciting. And it's such a site of cultural change for women. I think the figure of the shop girl is also really important in pop culture. They are a slightly less glamorous version of an artist model in that they occupy space in a department store full of fabulous goods. They work the counter. And by the 1910s, nearly 60% of young girls work, which is a huge cultural shift. And they work in places like department stores. So And not just department stores, they also work in places like Nickelodeons and concession stands at boardwalks, which are all becoming popular amusements that are affordable to most Americans. Um, in part, this is because of a change in dating. So instead of courting in your mom's parlor or on your front porch, men and women go out and they go out to places like Coney Island or to the movies or to see a vaudeville show. And so dating goes public, and now women are in public. And men who are trying to take women on a date want to know where they'd like to go. So these places, even though women aren't always buying the tickets, they are the ones that decide where they'd like to go. And so they become really important to early marketing. Again, this is a huge shift because prior to this, women wouldn't have been in these types of spaces. It would have been women on stage entertaining, but not women in the audience. And the Ziegfeld Follies is a prime example of this. They also kind of depict this image that I think you'll see a lot of similarities between a Ziegfeld Folly girl and some of the girls gracing the tops of Stanford White's buildings. Those beauty standards are omnipresent. They're everywhere in New York and cities like it at this time. Which brings me to the concept of the new woman, which I think is part of the driving force behind some of these depictions of women, which are not just in sculpture or in fine art, but in illustrations like cartoons. It's a golden age of illustrations in the United States. Cartoons are everywhere. Paper and magazines are mass produced. And they give everyday Americans access to these types of images in a way that might be similar to Instagram for us. And we have quite a few artists that we could talk about right now. I've picked just a few to get my point across. See here, there's the wallpaper of Gibson Girls. I think that's good fun and shows you she was on everything. She's on teacups, she's on wallpaper, she's everywhere. And this Judge article, I think, is a lot of fun as well. I don't know if you can see it, but that beaker says Vassar. And so it's kind of a commentary on women going to college. The Seven Sisters are founded in the 1890s or so. So women have this opportunity to get a higher education, and that is a big cultural shift and change. Women in graduation caps is a really popular theme in the early 20th century. I think the Gibson girl is probably the most popular depiction of the new woman and of this kind of beauty standard. She gets referenced a lot in tabloids that talk about Hettie and Audrey and their forms as being Gibsonian. So she is definitely, it's a compliment to be compared to a Gibson girl. See if we can see this. So the bicycle craze is, bicycles are considered this means of mobility for women at the time. They're a mode of transportation that's appropriate for women to have. It means that women can wear pants. I can't emphasize enough how it seems silly to us, but it's a huge cultural shift, and Gibson girls are riding them. So it's depicting women as participating in a leisure activity, in a leisure class, which is kind of aspirational for people. They're looking to become a part of this. But it's also a means of freedom and expanding rights for women. I think Gibson does a really great job of exploring that in a playful way. There's an image there of women serving on juries. Women don't have the right to vote at the time when he publishes that cartoon, but he's exploring the possibility of what it will look like for women to participate in civic opportunities the way men do. And he's doing that in a way that I think is great fun and palatable to your everyday American at the time. I think in part because Gibson girls are so physically in line with what was popular at the time. They match that beauty ideal so well that it gives you the opportunity as an artist to explore different ideas. And they are certainly part of that kind of emerging American identity. The US sees itself as young, educated, progressive, and these women who are active and well-dressed and at the beach. It's definitely indicative of a change. It's, a woman in a swimming costume is not something that would have happened 30 years before the Gibson Girl or 40 years before the Gibson Girl came out. I think Nell Brinkley's another great example. She's a little bit more modern. Her girls have heavier makeup and shorter skirts, but it's the same kind of juxtaposition of old versus new. You can see in that snowball fight scene, she has in a version of what a lady used to look like in the mid 1800s with the bonnet and the muff, and then her girls in those shorter skirts and berets playing in the snow. And I think that does a really great job of summarizing the distinction and generations that artists are exploring at this time. This is an image of Brinkley at work, which again, women are now in the workforce. They have jobs. I included her also in part because of this sketch down here. She's one of the few women admitted to the courtroom when Evelyn Nesbit Thaw is testifying in her husband's murder trial, and she draws her, and then that cartoon is like widely syndicated and seen. And so I think all of these images, I hope you guys are seeing some of the similarities between these cartoon images and the sculptures and the photographs of Hetty and Audrey. Now, maybe I could have skipped this, but I can't really mention the new woman without mentioning the suffrage girl. Women's suffrage used this image of girlhood that was popular with sculptors, that was popular with illustrators and cartoonists, and kind of manipulated it for a political purpose. The National Women's Party is a prime example of that. They had a really good, what we might call PR team. Nina Allender is at work there. She's the chief cartoonist for the organization, and she drew images of girls that I think bear a striking similarity to Gibson girls, and used them to talk about politics and to talk about women getting the vote. You can see Alice Paul down here in her graduation cap, again, a really popular image at the time, women in graduation caps, showing that women had access to higher education, not something that had happened several generations before. And I included this image here of Inesma Holland on her horse. I feel like it's a really popular image. It's from a 1913 suffrage parade. And women's suffrage movements at this time are kind of staging scenes. She's meant to depict, I think, liberty here. She has a golden crown and a white cape. She rode down Pennsylvania Avenue on this white horse, kind of bringing that sculptural ideal to life in promotion of women's suffrage. Oh. And classical figures are also very popular in pro-suffrage cartoons. I included a few of them here. You have that image of Victory, which is a Nina Allender cartoon. You have that Lou Rogers, which is women tearing off injustice and earning themselves the vote, tearing off the bonds of being unable to vote. And then you have this image down here, which obviously I think is meant to symbolize liberty. And this woman is coming. So for those of us that don't know, women in the West had the vote first. It was a state-by-state process at first. And so they're showing the Enlightenment kind of crossing across the United States in the hopes that the vote will come to women in the East as it has to women in the West. But again, that like very classical image, it was extremely popular and it was everywhere. I hope that I've made the point that these images of women were not just in sculptures, they're not just in highbrow art. I don't think you could escape them if you lived at the turn of the last century. They would have been everywhere you looked, and it would have embedded itself in your brain. And so I really thought that was important to kind of immerse ourselves in before we talked about Hetty and Audrey as individuals and as people. So we have an understanding of the world that they lived in and of the physical ideal that they were meant to represent. I think it helps us add a little bit of depth to their stories. So I'm going to start with Hetty. It's not a favoritism thing. I just, I think it would be easier to start with Hetty. And chronologically, she was, I think, active a little bit earlier than Audrey. So there's that. Hetty was born, now, I think before I get started with Hetty, I should say that some of the resources available to talk about Hetty, they're not in her voice. We don't have, and that's true for Audrey as well. A lot of the primary sources are in other writers' voices. And so when we talk about her in the historical record, we don't have her voice. We don't have her side of things. And there's a lot of interpretation that can be done. I tried not to do too much of that. But I just wanted to say that it's not an uncommon problem with women, and particularly women of color, but it's something I wanted to put out there before we dive into her story, just as kind of a general PSA. What we do know is that she was born Harriet Eugenia Dickerson in 1873 in Columbia, South Carolina. That before the Civil War, her family were free colored persons, so meaning they owned land and they earned wages. We know that around 1895, she relocated to New York City with her mother. She started taking classes at the Art Students League, and she adopted the name Anderson. Again, not sure why. It's pretty quickly after joining the Art Students League that she takes up a profession as a model. I think it's worth noting that her occupation in census records is not model. She is listed as a clerk or a seamstress at various points. So to me, that means that she wasn't perhaps earning enough as an artist model to make ends meet. She had other jobs, or maybe she wasn't comfortable with people knowing that she was an artist model. I mean, I don't know if I mentioned this off the top, but I think it should be obvious to us that posing nude at this time is a little bit scandalous. So it might not be something you lead with, and might not be information you want made public to everyone. If depending on your situation, I know that there are records that indicate that her family found it a little bit scandalous that she did this for work, that this was her occupation. And that wouldn't have been uncommon. People thought that of Audrey as well, but this is a little bit tinged in scandal. There's a few mentions of her in records from Saint-Gaudens in particular, a South Carolina girl with a figure like a goddess, which I think sums up why she was so in demand. I think there's another quote from him where he talks about how patiently she posed and the spirit in which she posed being thoroughly in the spirit that one could wish. I think Hetty did a great job of making herself in demand to artists. She had, and this is different, I think, from other artists models at the time, she had her pick of artists that she worked with. There are letters back and forth where Saint-Gaudens writes to other artists and asks if they might let her go for a few days because he needs her desperately. So she was able to kind of pick and choose who she worked with and modeled for. I find that really interesting and a credit to her as someone who took her job very seriously. There's a syndicated news item from 1896 where she's called a real life trilby, which is a reference to a novel about an artist model, and she's kind of the heroine of the novel. So there's not as many articles about Hetty as there are about Audrey, which I find fascinating. I think that it may have been that Hetty wasn't as eager to seek that type of promotion. But again, we can't know for sure. So I won't speculate too much, but I would suspect that might have something to do with it. I included the etching that's in the exhibit just because we have so few images of Hetty that I felt like any image of her face that I could include in this presentation, I wanted to, no matter how obscured it may be, just so you could feel that kind of physical connection as I was talking about her. And we know that in 1908, Hetty secured the copyright for the bust of her own face, which had been a gift from Saint-Gaudens. Again, I think that tidbit is important. We're working with tidbits here, and I think that piece of information lets us know that she was aware of the art world and how it worked, and the importance of securing a copyright to a work, and the value of the work that she had been given. So she's not just standing there plainly posing, she is an active participant in this art world. I do also want to bring up the bus story just because I think there had been some letters back and forth between her and the estate of Saint-Gaudens. They had wanted to make copies of her bust, and she wrote back, no, thank you. She believed that it was more valuable as the only one in existence. Again, I think that displays her knowledge of the industry in which she worked. It may also have contributed to her being pushed aside in the historic record. That in combination with that Stanford White murder trial scandal, I think between those two things, it worked against her. Um, the other information that we have about Hetty, we know that later in her life, she, in the early 1910s, mid 1910s, she started to have less work as an artist model, and she began working at the Met as a classroom attendant in about 1911. Her friends helped her secure that job. She worked there for a few years, and from there sort of fades from the historic record. There are a few mentions of her, but she struggles. She has some health struggles towards the end of her life. And by the time she passes away in the 1930s, she's living in the same apartment she had been living in prior, but is relatively reclusive. She, and this part is, I think, difficult to talk about because for someone who was so in demand as an artist model, who lived such a big life, she was buried in an unmarked grave. She now has a headstone as of 2023, I believe, but that is new. And I think it's fascinating to think about what that says about us as a culture and what we value, what we put value on, legacy and memory. And luckily, that seems to be changing. There's been a lot of scholarly work about Hetty recently, and she's definitely better known than she was in the 1930s when she passed away. She has a historical marker in South Carolina now. She has a gravestone, so things are changing. But at the time of her death, she has faded from public memory in a way that I think is worth noting. I'm gonna dive into Audrey now, not to take too sharp of a turn, but I included this image. The incredible amount of tabloid images I had to choose from for Audrey. It was a wealth of information and images. So I chose a few of my favorites. I liked this one because it places the real life woman in juxtaposition with the sculpture she posed for, which I always think is great fun. Some of Audrey's beginnings. So we know that she was born in 1891 in Rochester, New York, that her father was a streetcar conductor and a Western real estate speculator, and her mother was the daughter of Irish immigrants who worked as a corset maker, I believe, at various points in her life. Her parents divorced when she was about 8 years old. Divorce was pretty uncommon at this time, so that is definitely worth noting. It would have impacted Audrey's social life and how she was seen. Her and her mother moved from New York to Rhode Island after the divorce. And we know that she comes to New York around 1909 as a teenager. There are a lot of stories about how Hetty may or may not have been discovered walking down the street of New York shopping. But they feel a lot like manufactured Hollywood studio stories of a starlet being discovered, if you're familiar with any of those. So I don't know how accurate those are, but they're fun to read. We do know that she made her debut as a sculptor's model roughly at the age of 17. I think her first credit is with Isidore Conti. She talks a little bit about this in, well, there's a biography about about Audrey that kind of gets into this a little bit. But ultimately, it talks about how this is her first time posing in the nude and the all together. And there's speculation about what led her mother to agree to that. I think ultimately there was a need to earn an income. Corset makers did not earn a large amount of money, and Audrey's work as an artist model would have helped provide for the mother and daughter as a duo. So I bring that up because artist models are in kind of a precarious situation where their bodies are what are needed to pose. But financially, Audrey is in this sort of precarious, difficult situation, and it can get a little bit exploitative in the way that I think acting or modeling today can get a little bit exploitative, or a lot, depending on the situation. Um, Audrey at one point calls the Three Graces, which is the sculpture she posed for, a souvenir to her mother's consent. And it does begin a pretty prolific career as an artist model for Audrey. She is in at least a dozen public works in the city. One at the entrance to the Frick collection, one, the Pulitzer Fountain, so many sculptures that she earns the nickname Miss Manhattan by 1913. In 1915, she's chosen as the primary model for the Panama Pacific exhibition, which was held in San Francisco in 1915. It's a pretty major World's Fair. It's meant to mark the recovery of the city from the 1906 earthquake. 3,000 people died roughly, and 80% of that city was destroyed. So it's San Francisco showing to the world that they have recovered and that they are a booming metropolitan city. The Liberty Bell makes a trip to that exposition as well on a train from Philadelphia. So it's pretty major. And she is said to have posed for over 3/5 of all of the female sculptures in the exhibition. So she's everywhere. There's a lot of mentions in tabloids about whether or not Audrey has the exact measurements as the Venus de Milo. It earns her the nickname American Venus. So I don't know if I can emphasize enough just how omnipresent her name and face were at this time. In 1915, she kind of makes a career shift and she appears in her first silent film. She poses nude in that film. A lot of people credit it as the first non-pornographic film to have full frontal nudity. I don't think that it is. There's another film by Lois Weber that features an uncredited female actress in the nude as the naked truth. So Audrey's film is worth noting just because it passed the National Board of Review of Motion Pictures very quickly. And the justification that the board gives for why the nudity isn't a problem is her reputation and credit working as an artist model, that her body has become fine art and is therefore it's not censorable. It's considered art and can be included in a film without worries about obscene, scarring the public. It can't last though, as all good Hollywood careers. I included this image of Audrey on a tiger skin because it kind of connects to Eleanor Glynn, who's a novelist. I think the best modern day comparison I can give is 50 Shades of Grey. She wrote a novel called 3 Weeks, and there's a very explicit scene on a tiger skin. So if you see photography from this time featuring an animal skin, it's probably in reference to that novel. So the fact that she's posed in this way is worth noting. So Audrey faces some personal difficulties in the late 1910s. In 1919, her and her mother are boarding with a couple. That man, a 65-year-old physician by the name of Walter Wilkins, murders his wife. And when he's brought in by police to explain why he murdered his wife, he says that Audrey, the young woman living with him, is the reason. He hoped to be with her. Her and her mother are not immediately available when police look to question them. And even though, in all likelihood, Audrey did not have a relationship with this man, the newspapers kind of run with this scandal, and it does impact her reputation and her ability to get work. There are several career attempts to kind of revive her career. She's in another silent film, Purity, which both of her films are kind of loosely based on her life as an artist model. They involve her posing for very long stretches of time in the nude as though she's in the artist studio. I think that's probably part of the appeal. And she poses nude alongside the screening of the film, which gets her briefly arrested on a morals charge. There's a syndicated column, Queen of the Artist Studios, which is later revealed to have been written by a ghostwriter, but was an attempt to kind of get her name back in the press in a positive way. There's a search for a husband, which is another newspaper publicity stunt. Um, all of these, to me, someone who's really familiar with pop culture at this time, feel like attempts to revive a career that is struggling. Maybe the modern equivalent to this would be going on Dancing with the Stars. It's not something you do if your career is going well. Um, but it doesn't work out. And by the end of 1921, she and her mother are in upstate New York and selling kitchen utensils door to door and really struggling financially. In 1922, um, newspaper articles reveal that she attempted suicide. I don't believe this was her only suicide attempt. But by 1931, she's been institutionalized by her mother, and she will remain in that state hospital until she passes away at over 100 years old in 1996. Again, like Hetty, Audrey is buried in an unmarked grave. Her death doesn't receive the notice that you would imagine that it would for someone that was so famous in her heyday. And I don't want to get into the melodrama of a curse of beauty or anything like that, but I do want to say that it struck me when I was doing this research that both of these women were buried in unmarked graves initially, and that their names didn't receive the recognition that a lot of these tabloids thought that they would. I read a lot of newspaper articles talking about how long after the rest of us are dust, everyone will remember Audrey Munson and Hetty Anderson. I think the newspapers got it wrong, and instead what ended up happening, at least until recently, is that these women's complicated, nuanced identities were divorced from the faces in sculpture and in art that they portrayed. And I'm happy to say that that seems to be changing, that people seem to be more interested in the real life stories behind those faces that they're so familiar with, that exhibits like the one at the Michener and work by historians has shifted that. So I find that really exciting and a positive way to end what could otherwise be a little bit of a bummer. I did want to thank, in particular, Eve Kahn, who's done a lot of work researching Hetty Anderson and bringing her story to the general public. She was really generous with her primary source material, so thank you. And yeah, I have some like image credits here, so if anyone has questions, I'm not sure how we're doing on time, but I hope I have time for some questions.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Yes, we have two questions right now. I hope there's more. I know I have a personal one, but I'll save mine for last. Robert wants to know, you had mentioned that they were paid 50 cents per hour for modeling, and how does that compare to the pay for other jobs that women are working?
Interesting question. So we know that Hetty, when she was the Met attendant, was making $62.50 a month. So I think I did the discrepancy out. So I think it's $15 in today's money. So it'd be the equivalent of receiving $15 an hour. I'm not sure if that's helpful or if that answers the question, but I did look into that too because I was curious.
Well, it's more than the current minimum wage, so.
Right? Yeah. Still not great, but
yeah, no. Laura she noticed something. If you want to go back to the etching of Hetty Anderson, she said she thought that in the etching, Hetty Anderson and Saint-Gaudens portrays a cowering Anderson in the background. What is your opinion?
I don't see that. I think she's at rest, and there's something in her expression that looks relaxed to me. And it's like a hint of a smile. So I don't see her as cowering, but I can understand based on the way her body is why you might think that. But I'll have to think about that one.
So I noticed, and I don't know if you had in your picture of the awakening, the the promotion about the women's suffrage. The woman, the figure, yes, that one, she looks very similar to Victory in the Sherman Memorial.
Yes, yes. Um, I I see that too. She also kind of reminds me of the Statue of Liberty a little bit, with the torch. But yeah, definitely. Again, these images were everywhere, um, and were used in all different ways to talk about all sorts of different issues. But yeah, it's a really popular pop culture image of the 1910s.
Yeah, I definitely see in this Victory image, I've seen that pose with others in the exhibit, other sculptures. It's a very common. Oh, Laura, we have another question. Were
Okay.
both of Hetty Anderson's parents African American?
Now that I don't know. So from what I read in the census records, her mother at various times identified as Black or as mixed. And her father, we have a name for, but I didn't see a record of how he identified himself. So we know that Hetty was Black, but we don't, like, I don't have an exact, I can't answer that, unfortunately.
Okay. We have time for one more question if anyone else has a question. So, what was the most interesting thing that you learned during this, Rebecca?
I think I really enjoyed reading about some of the silent films that Audrey was in. I I wasn't as familiar with her work, and I love early silent films. So I was kind of fascinated to see the way that her career pivoted and that she was attempting to kind of um, make a change from being a model to being an actress and what that looked like. I read somewhere, and I couldn't confirm if it was true, so I didn't mention it in the presentation, but I read somewhere that in her first film, they weren't so sure of her acting skills, so she only did the poses. It's a lost film, so I can't see the film for sure. She only did the poses, and they brought in another actress to do the kind of like facial, mouthing of dialogue, which I thought was fun.
Oh, we have a couple more questions for you. Eric wanted to know, did Daniel Chester French also use these models?
Yes. So Daniel Chester French did Brooklyn, which is, let me see if I can scroll back to it. This is Brooklyn, and that is a Daniel Chester French sculpture, which Audrey definitely modeled for. So absolutely, he used these models.
And then Ellen wanted to know, where was Munson institutionalized? Do you know?
Yes, I do. It's the St. Lawrenceville State Hospital,
And where is that located?
upstate New York.
Okay.
Yes.
And is that where her unmarked grave is?
It's also, I think that's actually in her hometown, in Rochester, I believe. Um, but I think she may have a very small headstone now. So she was buried in the same plot as her father and stepmother, kind of at their feet. And I think she does have a small name marker now, but that is a recent addition. So,
Okay. Now this question, I'm not sure if I really understand it, but is there documentation that they visited the end product?
oh, like the models visited their own sculpture.
I think that's what that means. And if the person had asked it, yes, yes, they said yes. That's what.
Okay, yes. Okay, yeah, there is. So, Hetty working at the Met would have come across some of her own sculptures, and she owned a bronze of her own face. So, um, definitely. There was a really great newspaper article where they interviewed Audrey in connection with that 1915 exposition in San Francisco. And they asked her if she would be able to go to the exposition. And she said she hadn't been invited yet. So at the time of that, which the exposition was well underway, she had posed for three-fifths of the sculptures and had not received an invitation or like the financial means to attend, which I thought was kind of crazy. You would think for the publicity alone, they would have invited her.
Yeah, you would think, but
I think.
unfortunately, it doesn't seem like times have changed that much.
No,
These
I guess
young
not.
models and actresses. Um, last shot. Anyone have any more questions? These have been wonderful. And thank you, Rebecca, for answering all of these. Um, Now, Rebecca will also, if you're in the area, will be doing a gallery talk on December 4th. And she will be taking the guests around to see, looking at the sculptures and a little bit differently. So this was kind of a background. And so we have that. There's a few spots left. And we also have another upcoming virtual program by Dana Pilson on November 23rd. And that compares the artist colonies at Stockbridge, New Hope, and of course, I'm going to forget one in New Hampshire. Rebecca, do you remember?
Putting a C?
It's on our website.
It's on our website.
So I will be sending all that information out to anyone who registered. Oh, yes, Eric. Where can you learn more information? Is there an accompanying book for the exhibit, which we will see soon? Oh, Eric, I'm glad that you're coming. It is a wonderful exhibit. Yes, there is an exhibition catalog that you can purchase online or in our visitor services. And you can always find more information about the exhibit and all our programs at michenerartmuseum.org. And thank you, Marge, the colony at Cornish, New Hampshire. Thank you. That just totally.
It's been a long day, Jen.
Thank you. It's late. So it's comparing the artist colonies at Cornish, Stockbridge, and New Hope. So Dana Pilson from Chesterbrook is doing that for us. It is going to be fascinating. And thank you, Ellen. She said the catalog is excellent. I do agree. It's wonderful. So thank you very much. Thank you, Rebecca. This was fascinating, learning so much more about these models. And thank you all for attending. And we hope you have a nice evening.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone.